What's going on, guys? This is Rob. If you guys enjoy my content, make sure you hit the subscribe button and make sure you hit that little bell so you never miss out on my sexy voice. Okay, so we are covering X-Men Red, and this comic is actually really cool, and I was unsure about it in the beginning. I was like, okay, X-Men Red, like an X-Men team led by Jean Grey, but like she hasn't been relevant for like 10 years, one because she's been dead, and even before then, she wasn't really relevant about 15 years before then because there was really nothing interesting about her. And so I was like, okay, let's give this a shot and let's see what happens. This is awesome. It really is like a blend between classic X-Men storytelling with like Chris Claremont and like Tom Taylor's own style, and it works exceedingly well. Now, a little bit of a history here. I want to talk about this for a second. The reason why it's called X-Men Red is it's a break from tradition while maintaining tradition at the same time. So originally the chronology of the X-Men was that you had the X-Men title by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, and then that was not very popular, and so that was canceled 60 some odd issues in, and it was reprints for the next 30 issues up to 93. Then it was relaunched with Giant Size X-Men #1, and then it was retitled to Uncanny X-Men, and it stayed that way for 17 years. And so along the way, the original X-Men roster of like Beast and Cyclops and Angel and Iceman and Jean Grey, they were basically removed from the Uncanny X-Men team, and they were thrown into their own book called X Factor, which proved to be incredibly popular. And so by the time we got into the early 1990s, both titles were consolidated back down into a single X-Men roster, and then the teams were split in half. One team was called X-Men Gold, one team was called X-Men Blue, and they were covered in X-Men Volume 2 and Uncanny X-Men. So there were two X-Men books running at the same time. And so from there, having X-Men Red is designed to play on the color schemes of the X-Men Gold, X-Men Blue, but then like introduce a third element. The problem with this is that it was obvious, it's obvious it was meant to go on to be an ongoing series, but I assume that Marvel cut its legs out from under it because of the Fresh Start initiative, and they're rebooting Uncanny X-Men, or I guess they're bringing back Uncanny X-Men. And so all this is kind of consolidating things down. So imagine what they did in the early 1990s, condensed down to like 11 issues, kind of just bringing it all together. So in any event, this initially opens up with like some young girl, basically like a girl named Heather, who's essentially like has her whole, like her house just broken into and attacked by people in the local neighborhood. And it's literally just like unrivaled and kind of insane because they just unload on this girl, right? But of course, this leads to Jean Grey jumping in and basically blocking the shots. And then of course you have Nightcrawler and you have X-23 who jump in as well. Now, one thing I also want to mention here is that this story comes after X-Men Red Annual #1, which kind of creates the missing link between Jean Grey after the events of Phoenix Resurrection and the start of this. The problem is that has like a huge spoiler for what goes on in this story. So I don't really want to spoil that too much. We'll probably introduce that at a different time because it's just like a 1 or 2 page reveal that kind of gives everything away. But this goes into the introduction of a handful of interesting characters. I mean, you have basically Jean Grey, you've got Gentle, you've got Namor who's brought onto the team, you've got Honey Badger and X-23. For those of you guys who aren't reading X-23, Honey Badger was like one of the clones of X-23 basically. And in the Old Man Logan universe, the idea seemed to be that like Honey Badger killed X-23. So again, it's at least in the Old Man Logan universe, so it's kind of a murky situation. But regardless, this is like the X-Men Red team. And of course, we'll get some information on how each one of these characters was brought in. But this is an on-running theme that Tom Taylor hits out. He kind of jumps back 2 months before the X-Men Red team shows up to rescue Heather. And it's just like this mass in like this in a huge and insane instance of just like all around violence. Like violence is just increasing at an exponential scale. And it's kind of bonkers to see it happen because when these guys show up on this woman's car, she's got a mutant in the back seat. And of course, the mutant basically has like a sonic scream. Now, it's not like Black Bolt's quasi-sonic scream, right? Like that is one of the things that I kind of hope you guys notice here. Like it basically lets off kind of like this explosive impact, or at least it blows up the car and then so on. But the nature of the scream is very much like Black Bolt's scream. And because Marvel's running Death of the Inhumans at the moment, or at least it just finished with issue #5, but because they were doing Death of the Inhumans, it kind of makes sense they would take that and like roll it over to the X-Men, because that's one of the things that we're going to see here. New X-Men are going to be popping up. They're going to have powers that are equivalent to existing characters. So it's kind of like making the X-Men their own again. But you end up having Jean Grey and them who rescue the baby, of course, return it to the mom, and they say, look, you can go into hiding, you can do your own thing. Like we basically put a dampener in so your baby won't cry so much, which is kind of weird because how in the hell else is the baby going to tell its mom when it's hungry? It's just going to sit there and starve. But the fact remains, this switches over to kind of a news broadcast. Now, the way this news broadcast unfolds is very akin to something that we would see back during the days of like Project Wide Awake or during like Extinction Agenda. The idea was when Claremont and even people after him, Scott Lobdell and so on, whenever they were telling X-Men stories and they were trying to maintain like the real world element in terms of like, telling more of a soap opera than just like a traditional superhero story, you would see news clips that were thrown in there. And it was designed to give you a well-rounded understanding of like how the world viewed the X-Men, that it wasn't just just like, oh, these guys are kind of dangerous. It was how like the whole world saw them. And that's really what goes on here. That you have people who are just kind of like, hey, look, they're just mutants. They can't control what they are. And then you have others who say, it doesn't matter. Just because a man's a psychopath with a mental deficiency he can't control doesn't mean that we just let him on the streets for free. We lock him up. I mean, there's some pretty intense arguments that are raging back and forth that if they can't help what they do, then they should be treated like they can't help what they do and in turn imprison them. But that's kind of the nature of the way the X-Men arguments have always been. But what ends up happening is you have this really, really cool idea from Jean Grey where she basically goes around to like these various ambassadors or world leaders and says, look, I need all of your help. And she even goes to Black Panther. Now with Black Panther, there's an olive branch here. Because remember, back during the days of Civil War and even leading up to Civil War, Black Panther and Storm of the X-Men had a relationship, and really they'd met as children. It was one of the things that Marvel had introduced later on down the line, but they met as kids. And in the early days, they kind of had like this infatuation with each other because they were really too young to be in love. But eventually they ran back into each other again and then eventually got married. Now, of course, Black Panther nullified the marriage. He was just like, the high priest of the Panther cult nullifies our marriage. And he's like, there's nothing I could do about it. And she's like, but aren't you like the high priest? And he's like, bye, and then just leaves. It was kind of the crappiest way to nullify a marriage, but still, like that's the olive branch that's being brought in here. And so basically, her, going to Nightcrawler and showing him what her vision is to kind of bring about this peaceful coexistence. It's a lot more middle of the road than what Xavier would do, right? I mean, okay, so on one side you had Xavier who was like, just talk reason, and all that kind of stuff, just like basically be a hippie. Like if we fight the good fight and we do the right thing, then like they'll agree with us. We have to take the upper hand. And Cyclops is like, okay. So like if that worked, it would have worked by now. So like it doesn't work. So now we got to take a heavy hand. He was far more extreme by the time he became leader of the X-Men, going into like the post House of M, post Decimation, and like Nation X, Utopia, going into like all those stories. He became a lot more extreme. He was pretty heavy-handed. And so Jean Grey kind of has this middle of the road where she's like, it's not enough to just kind of sit around hoping things change, but it's a little too heavy-handed to be extreme. Like we can't force people to change. Instead, we kind of have to throw it in their face. And that's what she does. Jean Grey travels to the United Nations and basically says, look, here's how things stand here. If your concern is that somehow I could use my powers to swindle you, that I could trick all of you guys into wanting to believe a certain thing, that's entirely true. I could do that. I could have done that 3 miles away. Like I could have done that almost anywhere on the planet, but I'm not, because I'm not here to control you. I'm here to talk to you and to give you guys a better understanding of what mutants are and where we're coming from. Right now, like we are essentially a society unto ourselves. We are a culture unto ourselves, and we are a quote unquote empire, kingdom, nation unto ourselves. And as such, we want to be seen as one. Now this is a big move because Xavier never would have done this. And so while there is a lot of posturing, of course you have Namor who stands up and says the kingdom of Atlantis recognizes the nation of mutants, where you have Black Panther who stands up and says the kingdom of Wakanda recognizes the nation of mutants. While people do know the connection they do have to the X-Men, it works, and so of course you have like the chick from Britain who comes out and she's like, look, all that in there is posturing. I do it for the cameras, really because I have to, but at the end of the day, I'm on your side. And it's kind of cool here because as this chick starts to talk to Jean, this is where the story shifts. As this chick starts to talk to Jean, suddenly her demeanor changes. And she says, but the one problem here, Jean, is that you are not in control, and you never were. You're not the Phoenix anymore. You're just Jean Grey, which means you are powerless in the face of me. And like as Jean Grey kind of analyzes this chick's mind, she realizes there's somebody in there. Like there's somebody in the mind of this woman controlling her. And then this chick basically blows up this woman's head. Whoever's like running this, this chick's head explodes. And whoever's controlling this woman basically kills her. But it looks like Jean Grey does it because Jean Grey reaches out for aid. And at the moment that happens, this girl's head explodes. And so everybody who looks at that says, Jean Grey just killed a sitting world leader. And that's what we end up finding out. The person who's pulling the strings here, the person who's behind all this, is Cassandra Nova. Now that is not a small thing. And a lot of people who aren't really familiar with the X-Men are kind of like, who the hell's Cassandra Nova? All right, there are all manner of dangerous villains out there for the X-Men, right? You have Magneto, and you have like Mr. Sinister, and you've got Apocalypse, and you've got a Mega Red, depending on the circumstances. You've got a lot of characters out there who are very, very dangerous. Among all of these is Cassandra Nova. And depending on what story you're reading, either she's part of the Mummerdi, which basically means like she's a different alien, like she's a different race. She's like one of these ancient beings that exists out there. Or she was the sister of Xavier who Xavier absorbed into himself, but her consciousness remained on. But the general principle behind this though is that Cassandra Nova is exceedingly dangerous. She's going on like a warpath against mutants. The first time she did this was during EA's for Extinction, and she took a whole bunch of wild sentinels, she sent them all to Genosha, an island full of mutants, and massacred 16 million of them. And she's a wildly powerful telepath. Once she sets her mind to it, she can be nigh unstoppable. And that seems seems to be what's going on here. That Cassandra Nova, by whatever manner and whatever means, is basically pushing the world towards greater hatred towards itself and towards a mutant population. Now from here, we pick up with Jean Grey and company, who are basically sent like this super codec message that comes from a chick named Trinary. And we end up finding out that like Trinary is basically a technopath. Now, in Marvel Comics, there's a difference between a technopath and a cyberpath. A technopath is a mutant that has the ability, by virtue of their own mutant power, to tap into various technological systems, computer systems, all kinds of stuff, AI, so on and so forth, and then just like manipulate it to their own ends. A cyberpath is basically a non-mutant who can do the same thing. The difference is that usually cyberpaths are people who are super smart with computers, so like Tony Stark, or they're people who, by virtue of some enhancement like Cable, can tap into computer systems. Like Ultron can do that because he's basically a living machine. But again, like a technopath is kind of a way to say like the powers are basically the same, but a mutant versus a non-mutant is really what it is. Like Omega level mutants versus Omega level threats. At the end of the day, they're all the same thing. It's just one group is mutant and one group isn't. So again, it's kind of a cool little bit here. But Trinary is basically being held in India because her father turned her in, which is pretty shady. But the other thing about this, and this is kind of a cool moment, this guy named Lakshay, who's basically like the head of like these various forces, this intelligence group that's keeping Trinary hidden. It's kind of a cool thing here. This is one of the cool things I miss about like telepaths in X-Men comics, is what they do is this guy's on his way to getting coffee. And so what they do is Jean Grey basically warps his perception of the world. So the guy makes a left into an alleyway and believes he's ordering coffee while he's in there. It's a small thing, but it's cool. And it's one of the things that I kind of miss. And then Jean Grey scans his mind and uses that as a way to know what the layout's going to be, who's where, who's doing what, all that kind of cool stuff. It's one of the things that you don't really see anymore. So of course, Nightcrawler teleports in, grabs her, and then teleports out. And again, this leads to like the rise of this mob. And so it's basically this ongoing theme that like Cassandra Nova knows what Jean Grey's doing. And while she could stop her, while she could just like jump in her way and just unleash absolute hell on Jean Grey and probably take her down, at the end of the day, she doesn't. But it is kind of a weird situation because Jean Grey is still wildly powerful. And in the old new X-Men stories, it was shown that she was a little more I think she was more powerful than Cassandra Nova. It gets weird when you get down to that because there was so much there were so many metaphors, there's so much symbolism because it's Grant Morrison's storytelling. And nobody in the hell ever understands what the hell Grant Morrison's saying when he tells stories. I mean, hell fire. Just tell a regular story, Grant Morrison. But nonetheless, it is kind of cool, with like this whole mob showing up, and just kind of unleashing on things. Because for the X-Men, it's really more about damage control, right? I mean, the X-Men could fight them if they wanted to, but all that would do is make things look worse because from the perception of the world, Jean Grey killed a world leader. So it would just look worse and worse and worse. And so what you end up having is the Sentinel protocol that's initiated by this intelligence group in the government, which leads to like this Sentinel attacking them. Well, of course, they've got a technopath. So this battle is really, really, really fast. And basically Trinary takes a Sentinel down. And it's just kind of like, okay, like the Sentinel's down and is now essentially reprogrammed and that's it. But basically the X-Men are kind of like, okay, we need to get out of here as soon as possible because we don't need these things coming after us over and over and over again. And so in the midst of all this, like this is kind of a cool thing. You end up transitioning all the way out to Louisiana. And a lot of you guys are going to be happy about this. You transition out to Louisiana. There's one girl who's being attacked. Nothing too special about her. But in the midst of this whole attack, one of the guys basically somebody steals a stick from one of these guys, one of their flame sticks, and it's Gambit, which means Gambit's basically returning now. Like Gambit's finally showing back up in the X-Men universe, really after, some of the more recent events, and is basically going on to like rejoin the X-Men team, which again is kind of like this consolidation that X-Men Red is serving the purpose of consolidating all these mutant themes and bringing things back to the way they were before, which is cool. Now, while all that was going on with regards to Gambit and Jean Grey and so on and so forth, Cassandra Nova had basically slipped into the Xavier Institute, had gone up to Storm and then put something in her ear. And that in turn led to the X-Men returning to Wakanda and then Storm just unleashing hell and taking out their Sentinel. Now, the initial response to this is, okay, well, maybe Storm, all she saw was like a Sentinel approaching from the distance. And it's like, okay, well, obviously Storm would freak out and attack it because it's a Sentinel. The things are bred to kill mutants. What we end up finding out here is that even when Jean Grey analyzes her mind, she basically says, this is not Storm. Like, this is Storm, but something's controlling Storm. And so in turn, like, you have Black Panther that tries to reason with her, everybody tries to reason with her, and it doesn't work. And so this leads to basically this character Gentle, who's essentially the Incredible Hulk. Like, he literally grows in size, his strength increases, basically a mutant version of the Incredible Hulk, who does what he can to try to stand in the way of Storm. But of course, again, like, he's taken down like so many other people, and this leads to Jean Grey basically like attacking the mind of Storm, and in doing so, like basically incapacitating her for a time. And that's what we end up finding out here, that what's going on with regards to Storm herself is that while it is Cassandra Nova involving herself with Storm, it's not really telepathy, it's not mental control. Instead, what Cassandra Nova did was implant a kind of nano device in the mind of Storm. And this is actually super genius. This is super smart, because if let's say, for example, Cassandra Nova decided to sit down in like a recreated Cerebro and say, okay, I'm going to assault the world, then what this does is it creates a singular source to defeat. All the X-Men have to do is go to the singular source of contact, Cassandra Nova, defeat Cassandra Nova, and that's it. But instead, what Cassandra has done here is she's created an army of billions, which means the X-Men have to defeat each and every one individual person by taking this device away from their brain. It's one of the smartest things to do. But that's kind of the question that's being asked here, is the technology required to create something like this is highly advanced. Like, someone out there has to be creating these things. And so that's when we end up having like Cassandra Nova, who basically starts traveling around to like these different locations, to Europe, to Africa, to North America, to Asia, starts traveling like all these world leaders and basically saying like, I present you with a thing. And then basically like introducing this nano device into them and then turning them into like rabid anti-mutant individuals. Now, something else that I hope you guys notice here, this is something that I hope you guys are beginning to pick up, that Cassandra Nova is not alone. She's not by herself. She's met there with a third party. This third party looks like Forge, and that would make perfect sense as to why it is that she's able to pull all this off. For those of you guys who are unfamiliar with Forge is like, imagine Tony Stark. Like, imagine somebody being equally as intelligent as Tony Stark when it comes to engineering. The difference between Forge and Tony Stark is that Forge's knowledge of like machinery and complex components, like engineering and so on, that's his power. If you were to take away Forge's power, he'd be no more capable of assembling advanced pieces of machinery than like just some average Joe walking down the street. So having said that, he can invent a wide array of different things. His knowledge is to just know how things work, to intuitively know how things work. And so that's why things are kind of crazy, is because you end up having the X-Men sort of running back into Gambit again when, you know, they all kind of meet at this hospital with this guy who shot this girl when, you know, when Gambit was first introduced and so on. But when the X-Men do show up, Gambit's there, but doesn't fully know what's going on. All he knows is that like this giant sentinel just manifests in front of him. And that's when he really begins to freak out. You know, when the X-Men grab him, they pick him up, they say, okay, let's go. They teleport him back. And there's this giant sentinel standing there. Gambit panics, which again, that makes sense. I mean, that's one thing to bear in mind, guys. When it comes to the X-Men, because of how intense the Sentinels have been over the years, the Sentinels have always just been like this terrifying, ominous thing, because they're sort of like this walking, talking representation of like the death of mutant kind. And so for a lot of mutants out there, it's established PTSD. Fortunately for Gambit, this Sentinel's not dangerous. And why is it not dangerous? Because it's painted, because it looks pretty. Which of course was done by Honey Badger, which is kind of cool. I think it's adorable. Like, I think it's cute. Like, they named it and everything. They put like a big rainbow and everything. It's just like, it's a nice Sentinel. But one of the big things that's been going on here with Cassandra Nova basically implanting these nano devices in the ears of these world leaders, it's not really just like, hey, let's just kill everyone. What it is it's basically them like tracking down and annihilating mutants in their own countries, in their own places. And so again, it's basically Cassandra Nova, by virtue of her telepathy, alongside these nano devices, pushing humanity ever closer towards hating mutants, and then in their hatred of mutants, passing laws to eliminate mutants. Like, imagine Days of Future Past on like a much broader scale, on like a worldwide scale. But with Jean Grey showing up, with Jean Grey basically like facing off against all these guys, what she does is kind of override their minds and say, look, you need to actually see what's going on here. Not only that, at the same time that happens, Namor the Submariner shows up and basically says, you guys are touching water. And if you're touching water, you're touching my kingdom, you're touching my domain. So either you can back off or I'll eradicate every last one of you. And so because of the fact that the X-Men aren't really welcome, like, well, they can go to Wakanda, but it's not really a safe place anymore, because Atlantis hasn't been compromised yet. Basically, Namor the Submariner opens the doors up and says, you guys are welcome to take up refuge here. And that's basically what ends up happening. They end up taking refuge in Atlantis, they end up residing there, and at this point, it's just remarshaling their forces and see if they can't find a way to take out the forces of Cassandra Nova, to somehow fix humanity, to somehow fix these various government officials, and to see if there's a way to even salvage everything after it's all been said and done. In reality, I would say this is probably more akin to like the Summers Rebellion. For those of you guys who don't know, the character Bishop comes from a future which is almost identical to the Days of Future Past. The difference is that they had the Summers Rebellion, which was basically mutants and humans working together to cast off the Sentinel threat. When that happened, following that, there was an uneasy truce between humans and mutants, and that may be what ends up going on here. And what it does is it basically removes the government and the average group of people from the equation, and then it gives room for Tom Taylor to bring back like the Purifiers, and to bring back, you know, the Friends of Humanity, and to bring back the Right and all those guys, and to say, fine, if the governments of the world aren't going to take these guys on, then we'll do it. Then we'll find a way to eliminate mutants. Kind of setting things back to the status quo of how mutants of the X-Men used to be in like the 80s, 90s, and the early 2000s. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.